So why did Kathleen and I spend 14 hours driving all the way to Brownsville, Texas? The short answer is that we visited Starbase, which is located on the Gulf Coast east of Brownsville, near a beach and state park called Boca Chica. It's the site of the SpaceX Starship development and launch facilities. What exactly are these facilities, and why was it worth going all that way? Well, that's, as they say, a long story. For most of my adult life, my friends have been younger than me. One popular explanation for this is that it's a way to compensate for my general lack of maturity. I vividly recall sitting in the common room at my college dorm. Everyone was sharing their earliest memory of the world, and I shared that my first clear memory was having my daytime TV interrupted because President Kennedy had been shot. A young woman who had shared a memory from just a few years later looked at me in shock and disgust and said, "Wow, you are old." Ever since then, I've been reluctant to talk about it, even though it's a special memory. And I think about it like I was born in a box. A little 4-year-old me opened the lid, peeked out, and that was the first thing I saw. I sat there all day watching the TV. I recall how upset everyone was, and my mom too. I don't like people calling me out for how old I am. And the older I get, the more it stings. My plan is to just pretend I'm still 45 and see how long I can get away with it. So what I'm about to share didn't come easily because it means that I have to publicly own up to my age. I am a child of the space age. And what they called the space program, we grew up together. The first books I remember were about astronauts, spacecraft, and the push for the moon. I couldn't read yet, but I sat and looked at the pictures. Time Life had a whole series, and my mom must have bought their full space subscription or something because those books kept coming throughout my childhood. The excitement coming through those pictures and on the TV was palpable, even for a 4-year-old. A few years before I was born, the launch of Sputnik by our arch enemies shocked the whole country. As a result, there was a drive toward science education. Today we call it STEM education, but imagine if STEM was seen as a national priority, upon which the very survival of the nation rested. It was this post-Sputnik world that I was born into. And of course I became a scientist and an engineer. It was really a foregone conclusion. My kids have always told me that being a scientist or engineer isn't cool. But they are so wrong about that. When I was a kid, there was nothing cooler. Even the TV shows were all in. Lost in Space, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, The Time Tunnel, and of course later on Star Trek, which I watched in reruns after school every day. Even in I Dream of Jeannie, the man who brings her home is an astronaut. The Mercury 7 astronauts were my heroes, introduced to the world only a few weeks after I was born. I was 3 when John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. By the time I became aware, things were in full swing with the Gemini program, which was a 2-man craft used to learn how to do spacewalks and dockings, things they would have to do in going to the moon. Then came Apollo, and I remember staring at that horrible picture of the open hatch of the Apollo 1 command module after 3 of my heroes died in a fire on the pad. When I was 10 years old, I watched Armstrong and Aldrin walk on the moon, along with the entire rest of the world. I had a full model of the Saturn V, and I recall showing my grandmother how the launch worked and how the command module turned and docked with the lunar module and how they separated to descend to the surface. You know, my grandmother boggles my mind. She was born in 1899 in the era of the horse and buggy, before airplanes, automobiles, TV, and even radio. Think about that. The technological change she witnessed in just her first 20 years of life is astonishing. She lived to fly to Europe on a jet airplane and to see 2 men walk on the moon, from horse and buggy to the moon, in one lifetime. What she thought of my excited 10-year-old self with my big model rocket, I can only imagine. I remember going over every picture in National Geographic, which would have a big spread for each of the Apollo missions, until they were over and everything went quiet. The excitement faded, replaced by national scandals and a national malaise. It wasn't until I was in college that the first space shuttle launched. By then, I had my personal sights on science rather than spaceflight. But that didn't keep me from following every moment. And on my early 1980s home computer, I wrote a space shuttle launch to orbit simulator. It's a game that my friends would come and play. The space shuttle was an amazing technological achievement. But it didn't go beyond low Earth orbit, except in the movies. And it cost so much to fly that it sucked away all of NASA's budget for human spaceflight, leaving nothing for building bigger and better spacecraft. New projects would be proposed only to remain on the drawing board, or live only in computer animations. That was frustrating, and it went on for decades. So when they ended the shuttle program, I was cautiously optimistic. I knew it was the only hope we had to move forward. Now, I know it's not the most popular opinion in some circles, but I admire Elon Musk. I really do. I'm not a fanboy, I swear, and it has nothing to do with his being rich. I feel a kinship with him, and yeah, I know he has a middle schooler sense of humor, and he posts things on Twitter that tick people off. Sometimes they tick me off too. That makes him an easy mark for politicians and the mainstream media, looking to draw attention to themselves, which is all they really care about. Don't believe everything you hear. I see Musk as a sort of kindred spirit, as a version of myself, only a lot smarter. We both studied physics, which instills a certain way of thinking. We're also both programmers, which is a unique and often humbling undertaking, which accepts that the way to success is through repeated failure. We share a love of innovation and spaceflight, and that wonderfully naive Star Trek idea of building a better future. For those who may not know, as a young man, Elon Musk and his brother started PayPal. He stayed up late doing the original programming, working hard to turn an idea into a reality. He had intended to replace traditional banking completely, but he didn't have the clout to pull that off. So eventually, he had to sell his stake, and they paid him hundreds of millions of dollars. His idea of putting that money to good use? It was to send a terrarium to Mars with a camera so that young people could see life from Earth on another planet and be inspired. But he found out that even with all that money, it was too expensive to do alone, and nobody else was interested in helping out. The Russians basically tried to rip him off, and NASA had other things on its plate. So he did the craziest thing he could possibly do. He started his own rocket company with the goal of making spaceflight inexpensive by developing the first fully reusable rocket. There was a joke going around at the time. How do you become a millionaire? Well, you begin as a billionaire and then start your own rocket company. I don't really get why people dislike Elon so much. It's not like he hung out with Hitler, was a member of the Nazi SS, and built rockets using slaves to rain terror down on innocent Londoners. Musk is highly successful, but he's not motivated by power, fame, or greed in a world dominated by people who are. That alone is worth my admiration. Regardless, he has enabled a lot of engineers to follow their dreams, building electric cars, tunnels, direct links to the human brain, and of course, giant rockets. I followed the progress of SpaceX as I did the space program in my youth. The last decade has gone by at a crazy pace, just like in my childhood. In 2012, I watched an early Falcon 9 prototype called Grasshopper fly up, move over, and land.
Now, launch.
recall the day Elon revealed the Crew Dragon capsule with a crazy futuristic design, like something out of a Hollywood film. It seriously didn't look real. Then came the landing attempts. One crash after another. But they learned from each one. And then one day, a rocket booster actually landed, and the world had changed. Since then, they have stuck the landing 117 times in a row, upsetting the economics of going into space and more or less putting the Russians out of the space business. Then there was that Falcon Heavy test launch with a huge payload capability and those two boosters coming back together. To the music of David Bowie. Oh man, that was so awesome.
And that landing burn has started.
These two terminal buttons. Both boosters looking to be on track towards their respective landing zones.
Landing legs have started. Star boosters landing legs have deployed.
NASA granted SpaceX a contract to send astronauts to the space station in that futuristic capsule. It turned out it was real after all. And by the way, NASA also paid Boeing to do the same. Boeing demanded to be paid more than SpaceX. And years later, Boeing still hasn't been able to pull it off. If it weren't for Elon Musk, we'd still be reliant on Russia to send our astronauts to the space station. Eventually, it came to my attention that something was stirring near the beach at Boca Chica, Texas. This was SpaceX working on something new. When asked about it, Elon would talk of going to Mars. Even with the success of SpaceX, many didn't take him seriously, and that continues to this day. But why does he want to go to Mars? Sure, he thinks it would be cool, but it's not that simple. There is another more compelling reason, one championed by the astronomer Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan, in his wonderful book, The Pale Blue Dot, spends a lot of time writing about the reasons why we should not spend money on human spaceflight. He looks at each reason and judges each of them to be good arguments. But in the end, he comes around, making two arguments in favor of human spaceflight. About the value of science and exploration in general, he wrote, "The idea that we've now understood something never grasped by anyone who ever lived before, that exhilaration, especially intense for the scientists involved, but perceptible to nearly everyone, propagates through society, bounces off walls, and comes back at us. It encourages us to address problems in other fields that have also never been solved. It increases the general sense of optimism in the society. It gives currency to critical thinking of the sort urgently needed if we are to solve hitherto intractable social issues." Sagan goes on to list the many ways that human civilization and even humanity itself might come to an end, and concludes that it could happen sooner than we think. Then he writes, "This is the second of the missing justifications for a permanent presence in space, to improve our chances of surviving, not just the catastrophes we can foresee, but also the ones we cannot." Sagan is suggesting that, as a species, we need a backup plan, a self-sustaining colony beyond the Earth that might serve to preserve the spark of consciousness, as Elon puts it, should things go terribly wrong on the Earth. Sagan goes on to conclude, "In that case, on behalf of Earth life, I urge that, with full knowledge of our limitations, we vastly increase our knowledge of the solar system and then begin to settle other worlds. If our long-term survival is at stake, we have a basic responsibility to our species to venture to other worlds." When Sagan wrote those words in the 1990s, people nodded and agreed. But when Elon says the same thing today, many are skeptical. They often make the claim that Elon should spend his money to save the Earth instead. But that is missing the central point. It may be that no one can save humanity on Earth, no organization or government, and not even Elon Musk. In 2019, I watched a live feed from Boca Chica. A Starhopper, a water tank with a new kind of rocket motor hastily attached to it, took to the sky, moved over, and landed. Every engineer longs to do something like that. Just throw the thing together and fly it. And if it crashes, learn from it and try again. I was blown away when they revealed the first giant Starship prototype, looking like something out of a 1940s future, and learned about how it was supposed to belly flop into the atmosphere and then flip over at the last minute to land. By the way, they call that maneuver the crazy Elon. I gathered with others to watch online, all of us holding our breath, as the first Starship prototype flew high into the sky, dropped like a skydiver, then flipped over, only to crash in a brilliant fireball.
2, 1, 0. We have liftoff.
Now, how cool is that? Then there was that other time when it exploded before landing in a dense fog, so all we saw was pieces raining down in front of the cameras. On those cameras, they had been set up by ordinary people with YouTube channels to cover these historic events, which the mainstream media largely ignored. You weren't going to see any coverage on Good Morning America. Nope. They had more important things to do. Watching all this, I see a generational rebirth, with young people readying to replace a decadent establishment at companies like Boeing and the mainstream media. All the while, the doomed establishment carries on obliviously as if it's nothing of consequence. Finally, there was a successful landing. We all cheered. And then, oops. The next flight in May 2021 was a full success. The next step, go to orbit. Since then, as of April 2022, they haven't flown, at least in part because the FAA has been slow with their approval process. But I've watched as they built and brought out the enormous booster upon which the Starship sits, and as the production and launch facilities grew into a small city, eventually dubbed Starbase by Elon. All of this unfolds along a 2-lane public highway that ends in a state beach, and you can drive right past it all. Imagine it's 1968, and there's a Saturn V on the pad being ready for flight, and you could just drive right up to it, get out, and see it for yourself. Imagine seeing history up close, right there in front of you. Now, this next part may make some of you uncomfortable because it may contradict what your political media has been telling you lately. But please hear me out. That tired and empty deceit about spending money on space rather than helping people on Earth has been rolled out and given a fresh coat of paint. They added a bit of hatred for rich people and threw in some politicians looking for anything to bring them attention, and stood it up for people to rally around like some hollow cardboard cut-up. There's so much misinformation about Musk and SpaceX and NASA, it would take me hours to set things straight. They know that most people don't know anything about it, so they can just make up anything they want. So let me just show you this one thing. It's something called context. Without context, impressively big sounding numbers are meaningless. So this is the gross domestic product of the United States of America. It represents how much wealth is produced in a year. That's $21 trillion. You see this? That's the portion that's the entire budget of NASA and SpaceX, including research into aeronautics, rovers on Mars, R&D, Earth observation satellites, orbiting observatories like Hubble and the James Webb Space Telescope, the operation of the International Space Station, NASA's new Artemis moon program, and unmanned missions to the rest of the solar system. What Branson and Bezos have privately spent on their space tourism ventures is minuscule, even compared to this NASA budget. Yet that's what started all the complaining about cost and waste. And anyone who puts Elon Musk into that same category is just hate-mongering without regard to the truth. I'm satisfied that Elon Musk is genuine when he speaks about creating a future to get excited about. Okay, so we can't afford that. Throw it back in the pile. It's too expensive. Let's give it to the poor. We'll send all those scientists and engineers home and tell them to dream about something else. Oh, unless it were to go. Well, I hope it did some good. So where does the money spent on space actually go? Well, it mostly pays the salaries of engineers like these. These people get up in the morning excited to be a part of something, excited to see an idea turn into reality, because that's what engineers do. This is the very same feeling that an author has when writing a novel, or an artist with an idea for a painting, or a band composing a song. Science and engineering and art are all essentially the same. It is the very thing that makes us human. It is what makes life worth living. It's not a waste of time to write a song, even if only a few people will ever hear it. Or to write a novel, or to figure out something small about how the universe works. Or to play in a symphony orchestra, or to have part in building a giant rocket. No, it's not a waste of time and money. It's what makes it worth getting up in the morning. And that is something we should never lightly suggest taking away from anyone. And doing so will not magically give that opportunity to someone else. It's easy to be a cynic who can't see past their own nose. Paid to write a column. It's a lot harder and more impressive to make dreams come true. To change the world. Looking at Starbase, if I really was still 45, I'd find a way to be part of it. NASA, through Boeing and Lockheed, has built their own new giant rocket to go back to the moon. It's called the SLS. It's not reusable, and it'll cost $4 billion for each launch. That figure is clearly unsustainable. Congress is only funding it to keep their jobs in their districts. It's a dead end, just like the last time we went to the moon. If SpaceX can make Musk's dream of a large, fully reusable rocket a reality, it will land, refuel, and then take off again, like flying on an airplane. The only cost will be the fuel. This will be a gift to the future. It will finally open the solar system up to human exploration. It will make leaving the Earth inexpensive enough that everyday people will be able to go. Others will follow with their own rocket designs, and maybe we'll go to Mars, or maybe we'll colonize the moon, or Ceres, or just create a huge space station. Regardless, it will mark a new era, and it is currently the only way forward to heed Carl Sagan's warning. Unlike the dozens of computer animations that have been made in the last 20 years, This one's really going to happen, and it's going to happen in the next year. The initial tests will be uncrewed, and if you hear it crash, don't worry. That's all part of the rapid development program. Seeing for myself what just might, maybe, be the most important project in the history of humanity, seeing up close the hopes and dreams of thousands of men and women becoming a reality in the form of a giant rocket, now that's definitely worth driving 14 hours to Brownsville, Texas. And I can't wait to go back to see this dream take wing.